So could an employer choose to ignore the order? Right?
Yes.
Is that what you're asking? I mean, there will be probably a lawsuit trying to stop the order from going into effect. People are talking about that already, about the possibility of doing that. The power of the federal government to require employers to do this is theoretically no different from, federal law requires all sorts of things of private employers. So things like anti-discrimination laws or safe workplaces. The federal agency that's at issue in the order, OSHA, and the law that's at issue in that order, already imposes requirements on for employers to have a safe workplace. So the question will be, is requiring a vaccine or regular testing overstepping the bounds in some way, the bounds of that power? And so that's kind of one way to think about it.
Can an employer fire an employee if they're not vaccinated? Are you able to do that in Indiana law?
Generally what the law requires is for employers to allow for exemptions for religious reasons and medical reasons. There are, of course, people who are unable because of medical conditions to be vaccinated. And there are people who have a legitimate religious objection. The law has always required those sorts of objections. I think other than those, or if there's a contract in place, for example, if it's a union workplace with a contract that spells out specific agreements between the employer and the workers, those are the main things an employer needs to watch out for when it comes to vaccinations.
So basically, if my place of work is requiring a full vaccination, and let's say I don't have those exemptions, I just don't want to get vaccinated, they can legitimately, legally fire me.
Probably so.
Okay. And, I was thinking about this too, because let's say they do fire me. Am I eligible for unemployment then?
I think that will be up to the state unemployment insurance commission to decide what the rules are going to be about that. And it will probably come down to their decision about whether, for example, how reasonable it was, whether it was truly voluntary or not, things like that.
Is there a difference? I know that the executive order said someone could be fully vaccinated or they could require testing every week. But let's say an employer leans more towards being fully vaccinated. They don't even give the option to test every week. Is that a situation where someone like me, or really anyone else working for a large business, could lose their job over that? Is that something where they could go back and say, can I have the option just to be tested every single week?
I do think that it's riskier for an employer not to allow the test option, especially when that's what the federal government is saying. So
how do you say that?
Because it's going to look less reasonable, and it's going to look like the employer is less willing to work with and accommodate employees' concerns about, that caused them to take this position about not wanting to get tested or vaccinated. Now, meanwhile, one issue with testing is whether they're widely enough available. So some employers might say we don't have that they're not available enough for that to work for us. We're hearing some things about that, right? That whether that can be widespread, a widespread testing requirement every week is going to require, that's an awful lot of tests, more than is happening right now.
And it will be up to the businesses to provide those tests, correct? It wouldn't be up to me to actually go out and get myself tested and then bring it back to work, or does the business take responsibility for that?
I'm not sure the law really answers that question right now. I think that employers probably will want to make sure that they're valid, legitimate tests, and that the best way for employers to do that is to have some control over what test is used. And therefore, large employers are probably going to prefer to provide those tests themselves, again, if they can get them, if there are enough of them.
Right. So where does privacy law come into all of this? Because sometimes I think about where does HIPAA come in? Where does it come in where someone's asking me about my medical history, and let's say I don't want to tell them that I'm vaccinated or that I'm not vaccinated. Does that have any stake in this?
Well, the EEOC, there have been some different issues come up because of COVID. So the EEOC, for example, has issued some guidance about COVID being a direct threat to others in the workplace. That's very significant because it gives employers more cover, more opportunities to ask certain things of employees, for example, to take their temperatures, things like that, to require them not to come to work if they're feeling ill, things like that. So we do see some suspension of some of those concerns or some sort of carve outs because of the global pandemic. Because we should remember, the state of Indiana has declared this a public health emergency. The World Health Organization has declared it a global pandemic. President Trump had declared it a national emergency. So once all those things are true, and because of this view that when I say direct threat, that means employees who come on the job sick can in fact be a danger to others. That gives employers then just a lot more room to test, to require the vaccine, to ask for things like temperature checks and things like that.
Now, of course, there's the issue of liability too, right? Where if someone comes into work and they get sick from a business, or let's say they are given to January to get fully vaccinated, but that person doesn't get vaccinated until December, and someone gets sick and someone else is hospitalized, right? We see this surge in COVID cases. We see these surges in different variants. I'm curious if it's possible that me as an employee or the business could be held liable for certain medical costs, even if there is an outbreak.
Well, that's a new issue that we don't have much law about. Some states are passing laws specifically about that to say, to limit, for example, employer liability specifically. If a statute like that doesn't exist, then the question is, under sort of our plain old general common law rules, are you negligent, for example, as an employer? Did you act reasonably? Should you have known that there was someone there sick and you didn't warn everybody about it? Or you had again, going back to, you had no accommodations for workers who were sick. That's going to definitely increase your risk of legal exposure as an employer in a situation like that.
How much can our state law overtake the federal law? And I'm just curious, can our state leaders say, no, in the state of Indiana, businesses do not have to require you to be fully vaccinated or test you every week? Is there any kind of override they can have?
That's kind of the $1 million question from a philosophical perspective about how different people view the law differently. So you've seen already, tweets from Republican governors, statements from Republican officials saying this is an overreach from the federal government. Our system of laws generally is that federal law wins, and that federal law is superior to state law. On the other hand, there are limits to what the federal government is allowed to do. The federal government is not allowed to tell the states what to do in many circumstances, not allowed to regulate every little thing about our lives. So I would expect there will be a challenge to this. The argument, though, for the federal government, I think, comes down to the federal government's authority, for example, under the Constitution's Commerce Clause, which basically allows the federal government to regulate things that affect interstate commerce. That is, issues that affect the whole country, not just one place, but that cross state lines. And that, so that's what gives us agencies like OSHA, what gives us laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act and anti-discrimination laws and things like that. So states will certainly be free to argue, and some of them will, that this is the kind of thing that should be a state by state issue. States are free to make that argument. I think the argument will come down to arguments over what we call the police power that states have, which means they have the power to do a lot of things, to pass laws about all kinds of things that affect sort of the general welfare of people, compared to the federal authority. For example, under the Commerce Clause, the same law, the same type of law that allows the federal government to pass all kinds of workplace laws.
Are you expecting Indiana to be one of those states that does push back on this?
Well, look, I'm a lawyer, not a politics expert. From what I can tell, it seems like it's possible that some state legislators will want that. Whether the governor wants that, for example, I guess is yet to be seen.
And last question for you. I want to talk a little bit about money, because when you put this requirement on businesses, it can get a little bit of expensive when you're thinking about keeping all these precautions, right? You have to pay for the employees to take time off. You have to make sure that everyone's getting tested. Maybe businesses are providing more masks. Maybe they're having to social distance just to be extra safe. Hand sanitizer. I mean, all those little costs. And the more employees you have, the more it really, really adds up. And so I'm wondering if our business owner, like here at Wish TV, if he could reasonably say, federal government, you pay for the extra costs.
Well, I would expect, first of all, we don't have this new rule yet. So we'll wait and see what the federal government says about that. It is possible that OSHA, when this emergency rule comes out, that OSHA will say something about that, or the president will say something about that, or that the rule will address it specifically. It is the obligation of employers to provide a safe workplace. There are a bunch of details about what that means, but that's generally what OSHA requires, what the law requires. And so employers can get into trouble for trying to nickel and dime every step they take in order to provide a safe workplace. There will be union contracts that would prevent some employers from doing what you just mentioned, from charging employees for things like that. There will be arguments that that's essentially changing people's pay, right? That's essentially changing what people make, and their benefits with no notice. And I think employees have a strong argument about why that shouldn't be allowed.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, April. Is there anything else that I missed that you think people need to know about all this? I know there's just a lot of unknowns, and a lot of businesses are trying to figure this out. A lot of employees are trying to figure out what to do. I mean, a lot of people are already vaccinated, so they're saying, I'm not even worried about it anymore. But I mean, this could really change what things look like for unemployment, getting a job, staying in your job for the next couple of months. So is there anything else you think people need to know?
Well, the only other thing I would mention is we should keep in mind that the thing President Biden is directing here is perfectly in line with what the CDC has recommended is effective for attacking this pandemic. In other words, if he had issued a rule that was for something more drastic than like testing and vaccines, then I think there'd be a stronger argument against it. it's harder to make the argument that it's overreaching when it does match the fact that it's been declared a public health emergency, and the fact that it's sort of right in keeping with what all the recommended guidelines from the federal government have been all along. Vaccine and testing.
Yeah. All right, April, thank you so much. I really
Okay.
appreciate your time.
I hope it was helpful.
No,